Hey everyone, hope you're all doing okay. Welcome to the complete guide to PPSSPP Emulator, the PlayStation Portable Emulator. This is going to be a detailed guide and it's going to be very in-depth, so I'm going to put timestamps in the description. I do, however, encourage you to watch the entire guide to get the complete understanding and every single nuance of this emulator. To give you some context, these are the minimum specifications for the emulator. Anything above that is mid-end. Did you know that this minimum specification is not actually minimum? Yeah, you can run games with 60 FPS with playable resolution on a PC that is much lower end than this. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. And did you know that PPSSPP is not the first PSP emulator? Yes, there is this emulator called JPCSP that was introduced way back in July 2008, while PPSSPP was introduced in late 2012. I remember running JPCSP and boy, it was absolutely awful. I ran it in 2011. Even if you had a high-end PC back then, you couldn't even get playable FPS. The major reason was because it was written in Java. This language first of all requires a totally different isolated environment to run in, and it is not that powerful for emulation. If you want to emulate NES, SNES or something along those lines, it is worth it. But heavier projects have a lot of strings and modules associated with them. PPSSPP came and it absolutely shocked me to see the performance comparison between the two emulators. Even in its early development stages, it was amazing and gave playable FPS for most titles. There is a lot of hard work that went into it, but the major reason is because it was written in C. It runs natively on the machine without the need of an external environment. Since then, the emulator has come a long way, and honestly, you can run this emulator just fine with the default options. There aren't a lot of emulators that I can say this about, but there are so many options that let you run this emulator and upscale it if you have a really high-end PC, and also lets you downscale if you have a PC from the 2000s. If that wasn't enough, they have builds for iOS, macOS, Android, Linux, BlackBerry, Nintendo Switch, and even Symbian. Do you realize how overkill that is? You know Symbian, the Nokia operating system for mobile back in the good old days? At this point, the developers are just flexing on us. So to get started, we're just gonna download it. As all of my guides, I highly recommend installing DirectX, Web Setup, and Visual C++ redistributables from 2010 to 2019, both x86 and x64, because they can get rid of most of the errors. There are two ways of downloading this emulator. First is the official stable release, and the other one is nightly builds. We're gonna go with the stable release because there is no benefit of running the nightly build in this specific scenario. So let's download it. We're just going to write PPSPP download, and then this is the first website that you go to. So look at all this: Windows, iOS, Switch, BlackBerry, Migo, Symbian, Pandora, Linux. Oh my god. So you can download the zip file, and I actually recommend downloading the zip file because everything is pre-installed and you just have to extract it. I've already downloaded it, so I'm not going to download it again. And I have the folder open here, so we're just going to launch the 64 version, and let's go to full screen, or even this is fine. Now there are two versions of this release: Windows 32-bit and 64-bit. If your PC supports a 64-bit platform, please run it, otherwise you might not get the optimal performance. Before I get into the options, I should mention that I'm gonna divide the options into 4 categories. One's for higher end PCs, one's for lower end PCs, ones that should always be turned on or off regardless of the specifications, and the ones that are experimental. So let's get to the UI. In our UI, we have load, open directory, open from MSPSP game, so that's a specific directory. Open memory stick, if you want to open up the virtual memory stick, open new instance. So if you have 2 games running at once, so you can actually open a new instance. It will open a brand new PPSSPP window, and you can actually play something else on here. So that's pretty cool. I haven't seen a lot of emulators do this. We have save state slot if you want to save your game, load state file, save state file if you want to record or exit. In emulation, we have pause, stop, reset, switch to UMD, the PSP source media, And if you want to display the rotation, then that's totally up to you. These are all debug options, or disassembly and GE debugger, and we're not going to get into that. But if you are a developer and you want to debug stuff, that's up to you. Then we have game settings. I'm gonna go into that a little bit later. So first I want to cover the UI, and then in help we have all these different things. If you want to buy gold as a way to support the developers, I recommend doing that actually. In recents, is this gonna show our recent files, and then homebrew and demos. If you want to run just like a demo or like experimental ISO, you can run it from here. This is our grid view and this is our list view. And then our settings, this is home. This will actually enable us to go full screen. So actually let's go full screen. Yeah, that's better. I don't know why this pops up, it's so annoying. Load credits, all of that is pretty self-explanatory so far. So let's get into the settings, the meat and potatoes of this tutorial. So first up is graphics, and there are a lot of options to go through, and I'm gonna try my best to explain them as much as I can. First up we have backend. In backend we have OpenGL, Direct3D 9, Direct3D 11 and Vulkan. For mid-end to high-end PCs, I would always recommend using Direct3D 11. Please always use this. I think low-end PC means something different to everyone, because I remember an era where low-end PC meant a really low-end PC, and we're talking megahertz of speed in terms of the processor speed. It wasn't even gigahertz. So please always try to run Direct3D 11, but again, if you have a low-end PC and you're not getting playable performance, run Direct3D 9. OpenGL is only for accuracy, and I don't recommend running it because only if you have a high-end PC and you want the utmost accuracy, not the smoothness. So that's up to you. You can run OpenGL. And Vulkan is also for high-end PC. So if your PC actually supports Vulkan, you can use that. But again, I would recommend Direct3D 11. The reason is this implementation have had so many iterations and revisions that they have managed to work out all the possible bugs. But Vulkan is new to this emulator, relatively new. So that's why we will always use Direct3D 11 even on a high-end PC. So that's what I recommend. But Vulkan does have its advantages. So if you're running an open world game and your PC is not that high-end and you don't want to deal with shaders and compilation of shaders, you can actually choose Vulkan. But again, 3D 11 is the best option. Then we have our device. It's selected my GTX 960M. I'm on a laptop, so it's a pretty low-end card. So it's already selected that, but if you have multiple cards, you can select it from here. Microsoft Basic Render Driver is just for debugging purposes, because in most cases it gives you null output. So that's why we never use this. So we're only going to use these two. So either your dedicated graphics card or your onboard chip. So if you have a dedicated graphics card, you can actually select that from here. But if you're on a low-end PC and you only have an onboard GPU, you can select that one. Then we have mode. So it's buffer rendering and skip non-buffer faster. I remember there used to be 4 options in here, but they removed the extra 2 because I think most of the stuff is pretty much behind the scene and implemented in the emulator itself. So our buffer rendering is actually a technique where you actually see the contents of the game, what's going to happen, and it's actually going to make an informed prediction. It's going to load the contents and then it's going to run. So it gives you a lot of smoothness and accuracy as well. That's why we always select buffered rendering. And skip buffer effects is you do not do buffering in this scenario. So if you have a low-end PC, you would select that, but we always select buffer rendering. And again, this has so many iterations and revisions that this is the option to go with. But if you have a really low-end PC, select skip buffer effect, so it's not gonna buffer, it's just gonna run straight away, which can feel a little bit irregular because the playing patterns can differ. Then we have mode simulate block transfer effects. It's just the simulation of the animation, so that's why it's selected. You can disable it on a low-end PC, but it doesn't take that much of a performance toll, so I recommend keeping it enabled. Then we have software rendering. So let's say you have a Surface, a Microsoft Surface Pro, and you don't have a high-end dedicated graphics card. You don't even have a high-end onboard graphics chip. In that case, you would select software rendering. Or let's say you're running on a safe mode. I don't know, like this scenario doesn't even apply to anyone, I think. But let's just imagine you're running on a safe mode and your graphic card is actually disabled, and then you would select software rendering if you really want to run your game, and it will actually render the game using the software instead of using the hardware of your graphics card. So I think it's for experimental purposes. But if you don't have the onboard GPU and the dedicated GPU, this is your best option. And I think if you have a capable processor and RAM, it can actually give you playable FPS and also very good resolution. Okay, then we have frame rate control. First up, we have frame skipping, and here you can actually select the number of frames that you want to skip. It goes up to 8. I don't know why it goes up to 8. It should go up to a little bit more, but I think if you go higher than 8, then you're not gonna get a playable experience. It's gonna skip way too many frames to know what's going on the screen. And then we have frame skipping type. Number of frames or percent of FPS. It's totally up to you if you want to skip a number of frames. So for example, let's say it draws 60 frames per second and you want to skip 7 of them. So it can actually give you a playable performance. But if you want to skip a percent of FPS, so let's say 60 FPS and I want to skip 20% of that, you can also select that. Auto frame skip is an option where it just detects your game and your specifications and it skips accordingly. So let's say you have a high-end PC and you have this enabled. It won't actually skip any frame, only maybe in some loading zones, but it will actually look at your game and your specifications and decide whether the frame skipping is necessary or not. Then we have alternative speed. So if you want some game running at 200% or 300%, let's say you're running through credits, you just ended the game, you're running through credits, that's when you would use, and you can't skip it for some reason, then you would use 300%. Then you have alternative speed 2, and then it's disabled. They don't really have use case, in my opinion. Then we have our post-processing shader number 1. So if you want to customize the actual graphics, you want to apply a filter, then you would actually use this one. So they have a bunch of shaders here. I would say that FXAA anti-aliasing is pretty good. So you can actually use that one. But I always keep it off because this unnecessary calculation, unnecessary workload, and the games look just fine without it. So you have CRT scale lines. If you want that monitor effect, you can do that with grayscale, bloom, sharpen, and then we have a bunch of other post-processing shader. PSP color is a particular one where it would just use like PSP color. It would try to emulate that, but I recommend keeping it off. You can actually enable more than one post-processing shaders, but again, it's just unnecessary load on your computer, and I won't recommend it even if you have a high-end PC. We have full screen, yep, and display layout editor. It says auto scaling. I will leave it to auto scaling. You can actually use it as a portrait if you want. Rendering resolution is auto. So I would recommend using 2x PSP or 3x PSP. So they are pretty self-explanatory. At 2x, I'm just gonna run 2 times the resolution of a PSP. So if your PC actually supports it, you can actually use one of these options. up to you. So let's select 2x PSP. It's a sweet spot where you're not actually taxing all of the resources of your computer, and it would also give you a pretty nice resolution to play with. VSync is if you have your screen tearing effects on your screen for some reason, you can enable it, but I always keep it disabled. It's unnecessary workload. Render duplicate frames to 60 Hz is actually disabled, and I think that if I enable it to Vulkan or OpenGL, it will actually let me enable that, but we're gonna go into that later. Hardware transform is enabled, and it's actually a very good speed up option, and you should always have it enabled. So it actually tries to transform your hardware. So as you know, PSP has pretty low specifications, but if you can emulate natively, that's fine, but you can also use the full resources of your hardware. So that's why we have this option right here, and you should keep it enabled. And then we have software skinning as also a pretty good option, and it can give you a little bit of speed up, but if you're on a high-end PC, you might want to disable that. So it's actually experimental. With some games, it can cause a little bit of hindrances, so just use it occasionally, depending on your game. And then we have Vertex Cache. Vertex Cache can actually give you performance boost. So if you're on a low-end PC, definitely always enable that. It says may cause temporary flicker, but with the majority of the games, it's not the case. It's just fine. So you would enable Vertex Cache if you want speed up. But on high-end PCs, your graphics card has actually got a cache of itself. So in that case, it would be pointless to use Vertex Cache when your graphics card cache is actually faster. Clear frame buffers on first use. So for some reason, if you're not running your game correctly and you're getting some runtime errors, you can actually use this one. So it's going to clear frame buffers on the first use. This is going to clear all that data. And if you want to, if you're debugging this emulator, I think for a specific title, you would enable that, but keep it disabled for the most part. Lazy texture caching, again, this is a technique where the texture caching is not preferred, and it can actually reduce the calculation, reduce the load, and give you a little bit of speed up. But it can also take a toll on your accuracy. So I would say that keep it disabled, but if you have a really low-end PC, enable it. Retain change textures, again, it's pretty similar to the option to this one, but it can give you a performance boost. In majority of the games, just keep it disabled, but in some experimental games, so you know, in PPSSPP website, they have a compatibility list, and the ones that are in game, and there are only a number of games, you can actually try enabling that, so it might solve some of the bugs. So it's an experimental feature. Disable slower effects, again, pretty self-explanatory. It's going to give you speed up, but if you want the accuracy, don't enable it. Spline, Bezier curves, quality. So all of the shapes, the curves, quality, how do you want it to be? You can select it low, medium, high, and the workload actually increases as you go high. So I think high is a pretty sweet spot. So if you have a mid-end to high-end PC, select it high. It doesn't take that much of a toll on your performance, but if you're a low-end PC, just keep it to low or medium. You would keep it to medium if you're a low-end PC, but if you're really, really low-end PC, just keep it to low. Hardware tessellation, these are your rectangles, your triangles, your rectangles. And you would enable that. So this is going to give you a really, I think, accurate experience, but it also takes a lot of toll on your performance. Only enable it if you have a high-end PC. Then we have our texture scaling. Upscale level is off. So I just want to take a moment to talk about upscaling level and the resolution. So we're rendering it at 2x PSP, but it's just going to render it at 2x PSP. So let's say the PSP resolution, for example, is 480p. So it's just going to render 2 times 480p. But upscaling is just enhancing a little bit more to give you that extra resolution and extra crispiness in your graphics. So upscaling level should be selected to 2x or 3x. I can select it to 5x on this PC. I can actually select it to 5x. But at that point, the games look so artificial. They just lose the naturalness to them. So that's why I always use it to 2x or 3x, because 5x is just way too much upscaling to a point where you can't even recognize the game anymore. So yeah, upscaling type is XBRZ, and we have hybrid. Then we have hybrid plus bicubic. If you select this one, it's gonna take a toll on your performance. It's gonna increase your workload. So I would suggest XBRZ. Again, this has had the most amount of revisions and bug implementations done to it. So that's why you would select XBRZ. These are two different techniques, but this is the most appropriate one, regardless of the specifications. And then we have deposterize. This is also an upscaling method, but this is an experimental option, so you would only use it for experiments. Then we have texture shader. It is off. I'm actually going to go into that later. So the options that are disabled, I'm going to go into that later. Anti-scope ring filtering is 16x. I would suggest 4x or 8x. 16x is way too much. That's why some of the time the graphics can look so artificial when you have 2x PSP, then you have upscaler, then you have anti-scope refiltering. So because it wasn't 3D, like in spirit, it wasn't 3D, the graphics weren't amazing. The games were made for a 4-inch screen on a PSP. That's why these options, in my opinion, are overkill. That's why you would want to keep it to a minimum, even on a high-end PC. So that's just my opinion, and that's something that I've learned running this emulator and running various titles. Then we have texture filtering. I would also always select auto, so let it decide, or you can select nearest or linear, depending on your preferences. But I would suggest auto. Let it decide on the title base. Then we have screen scaling filter, which is linear. Again, the same thing as this one. So if you have this auto select, you don't need to worry about this option. Then we have our camera device, integrated webcam, low resolution, for effects. So if you don't want the low resolution like entirely in your game, just on the effects, then you can turn this on. And it reminds me of the PlayStation 2 emulator, because they have the safe, balanced, and aggressive. So how much do you want it to be? Like how low resolution? Aggressive is just if you have a really low-end PC, but it's kind of counterintuitive, because this is going to increase your workload as well. So if you have a low-end PC, you're better off just selecting safe or off. Then we have overlay information, show FPS counter, and show debug statistics. These are if you want the information to be displayed up here, then you would select that. Now let's go through Vulkan, and a lot of options are going to get enabled now, because a lot of options are actually specific to Vulkan. So now we have texture shader, and these are two techniques, 4XBRZ and MMPX. MMPX haven't had that many revisions to it, so you can actually select the texture shader. But as I mentioned earlier, Vulkan is relatively new, so it might not give you the playable performance. It's going to give you a lot of accuracy, but maybe it can take a toll on your FPS. To be honest with you, I haven't tested it, but that's my prediction. So that's how it's now enabled. And this one is still not enabled. I think this is supposed to be the OpenGL render. No, still not enabled. Or we might have to run a game or something. That might enable it. So I think if you have a higher refresh rate, than 60 Hz, then it can actually help in that scenario. I would say that it's an experimental feature. Let's go to audio. We have enable sound, sure, global volume, then alternate speed volume, and then audio backend restart required. It says D sound is just selected to auto. It doesn't make that much difference, and this section is actually not relevant to performance. Again, as all of my emulator guides, I would suggest disabling the sound if you have a PC from the 90s. It can give you 2 to 3 FPS increase in some cases. Then we have controls, and actually these emulator controls are just way too good. They're amazing, and look at all these options. You can actually do control mapping, so for all of your buttons. And here we have the function keys. So if you want to assign something to these, you can. So a lot of options there, and it's actually kind of overwhelming as well. So it says ignore game pads when not focused. So if you have minimized the windows, then they're not going to be on focus. If you have an on-screen touch, if you want to play, let's say you're on Android, you only have the on-screen, then you can use that. Then we have dead zone radius. So let's say you accidentally press something, or you accidentally touch something, then you can actually specify what should your dead zone radius be, so you won't accidentally trigger something. Then we have analog mapper mode. So if you want to map some specific keys to some specific options, that's your go-to right there. And then we have keyboard control settings, and then we have mouse settings. So you can actually use a mouse if you want. Well, that's good. In some cases, in some titles, it can come pretty handy. Then we have networking. So visit ad hoc multiplayer forum if you want to visit the forum. So enable networking VLAN, and this one actually only works in like very controlled scenarios. So I don't recommend using the networking feature because it's still in beta. And I tried using it on Tekken, but I was waiting in the lobby forever and no one came. So I think that might be the emulator itself, not the game. Then we have our MAC address in here. And then we have ad hoc server and chat, and then miscellaneous if you want to mess around with these options. But again, I would recommend not enabling this. In tools, we have the save data manager. If you want to mess around with your save files, load files, then we have system information, developer tools. In developer tools, we have CPU core. So if you want to run it on interpreter and you want to debug something, you can actually select it from here. And then all these debugging options. Remote disk streaming. This is another experimental option. I don't recommend using it. So it's going to stream a disk ISO or a CSO on a network, not on your disk. Then we have system settings, the language, the UI sound. So remember the sound that PSP plays. If you want to play that exact same sound, enable compatibility server reports. I never enabled it. So if you want to send feedback about some of your performance issues, you can actually enable that. Fast memory, unstable. So these are the actual emulation options, and these can help with your performance. Fast memory, always keep it enabled, whether you're on a high-end or a low-end PC. I know it does say unstable, but again, so many iterations and revisions have happened that this is actually very stable, and it's a very good speed-up option without losing any of the accuracy, smoothness, or FPS. Then we have ignore bad memory accesses. So let's say you get an error, runtime error, so you might want to ignore that for some reason. That's why it's enabled. But in some of the titles, it can actually get really bad, so I would always suggest to keep it enabled. Then we have input output on thread experimental. Again, leave it enabled because alongside your CPU core is also going to use threads. IO timing method is fast, lag on low storage. So I would suggest just keep it to fast. Yeah. Then force real clock sync. I don't recommend using this option only in a few titles, so this is a pretty experimental options. Then change emulator PSP CPU clock. These are all the options that we have, and these aren't really that performance oriented. Then we have general, check PSP for new versions. If you want to update them, set UI background. If you want to set it to a specific thing, that's up to you. Check full ISO in RAM. Cache full ISO in RAM. I actually misread that. I have 16 gigs of RAM, and if I have a 1 gig of ISO, I can actually fully cache that in RAM, and it's gonna run faster than it would have run on the hard drive or the SSD. Then we have enable cheats, PSP model. Which one do you want to emulate? 1000, never select that because there's no point. We go 2000, 3000, and then we have all these other options for your specifications, and I think that's it. We've gone through all these options. Again, some of them are the experimental options, and you should only enable it when you've tried everything else, and the other ones should always be enabled or should always be disabled. Now that we're done with the options, I'm gonna tell you this recommended settings for low-end PCs. So you will go into settings, and I'm talking about a really low-end PC, then you would use 3D9. So we're using 3D9, and we're also using buffer, non-buffer rendering. Again, I want to iterate, this is for a really low-end PC. Simulate, then frame skipping is set to auto. Post-processing shader is off, then full screen is on. Rendering resolution is 1x PSP. We want to put as like really low, just minimum load as possible, as minimum as possible, as less load as possible. Hardware transfer, you would enable it, but software skinning you would disable. Vertex cache you would enable, lazy texture caching, and then disable lower speed up. And then in here you would select low. Upscaling level you would turn off. And XBRZ, deposterize, you wouldn't enable it, and then anti-scope ring all the way to off. Camera device, I don't think you can do any of that. And in system you would enable fast memory unstable. And there you have it. These are your options for your low end. Now let's talk about high end, mid end to high end PCs. 3D11. We have 3D11, buffer rendering, yep. Simulate transfer effects, yeah. Auto framescape is off. Frame skipping is off. Full screen 3x. We don't want VSync. We have hardware transform. Vertex cache will disable. Lazy texture caching we will put high, and hardware tessellation. Upscale level is 3x. XBRZ. And there you have it, guys. That was your complete guide to PPSSPP. It's a really impressive emulator, and I just can't get over the fact how many platforms it's available on. So I hope you found this guide useful. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Catch you guys later.